Hey there, welcome back. Tonight we're stepping into a different kind of realm, one where desire moves like the tide, where beauty can start wars that burn for decades, and where love, in all its forms, rules with a gentle hand or an iron fist, depending on the day, the hour, the heartbeat. This is the story of Aphrodite, goddess of love, beauty, and just about every complicated emotion that comes with those territories. She's been called the foam-born, the golden one, the laughter-loving goddess Cypris Cytherea, and yes, occasionally the killer of men. She's as complex as the human heart itself, which makes sense, because that's precisely what she governed. Picture her for a moment. Not the sanitized marble statues we see in museums, cold and distant, but as the Greeks imagined her. A goddess who moved through the world, trailing the scent of roses and myrrh, who could walk into a room and shift the very atmosphere, making hearts beat faster, making the air feel charged with possibility. She didn't need to speak to command attention. Beauty, real divine beauty, was its own language, and Aphrodite spoke it fluently. But here's what makes her story so fascinating. She wasn't just a pretty face on Mount Olympus. She was dangerous. She meddled in mortal affairs more directly than perhaps any other Olympian. While Zeus hurled thunderbolts from a distance and Athena offered wisdom from behind her aegis, Aphrodite got her hands dirty. She whispered in ears, planted thoughts, stirred up desires that led men to abandon their kingdoms and women to betray their husbands. She was intimate in a way the other gods weren't, because love is intimate. It gets under your skin, into your thoughts, wrapped around your heart until you can't tell where you end, and the feeling begins. The Greeks understood that this made her powerful in ways that had nothing to do with physical strength. You could fight Ares on a battlefield. You could argue with Athena in a council chamber. But how do you fight desire? How do you argue against your own heart? You don't. And that's why Aphrodite, despite never wearing armor or wielding a weapon, was one of the most formidable beings in the entire pantheon. If this kind of storytelling helps you drift off, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if it truly brings you peace. And if you'd like, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is right now. There's something comforting about knowing we're all scattered across this world, drifting through different hours, finding quiet in the same stories, connected by these ancient tales that somehow still speak to something fundamental in the human experience. So settle in, get comfortable, dim the lights if you haven't already, and let's begin with the tale of Aphrodite, goddess of love, born from violence, crowned in roses, forever walking the line between creation and chaos, beauty and bloodshed, ecstasy and ruin. There are two stories about how Aphrodite came into being, and neither one is particularly gentle. The Greeks loved their origin myths, but they rarely made them simple. In one version, she's the daughter of Zeus and a titaness named Dione. This makes her a proper Olympian, born in the usual divine fashion, part of that sprawling, argumentative family that ruled from the clouds. It's tidy, it's respectable, and honestly, it's a bit boring compared to the alternative. The other version, the older one, the one that feels more raw and strange, comes from Hesiod, and it begins not with birth but with violence, with pain that had been building for eons. Long before the Olympians sat on their thrones, before Zeus hurled his first thunderbolt or Hera perfected her withering glare, before there were temples or prayers or sacrifices, there was Uranus, the sky, and Gaia, the earth. They were among the first beings to emerge from chaos, that great yawning void that existed before existence itself. Uranus was vast, covering Gaia completely, the starry sky pressing down upon the fertile earth in an eternal embrace that created life, but also trapped it. Gaia bore many children to Uranus. First came the Titans, 12 mighty beings who would one day rule the cosmos. Then came the Cyclopes, those one-eyed giants who would forge lightning bolts for Zeus. And finally, the Hecatoncheires, the 100-handed ones, monsters of unimaginable strength. Uranus looked upon these children, especially the monstrous ones, and he was filled with disgust and fear. What if they overthrew him? What if these beings he'd created became powerful enough to challenge his rule? So Uranus made a terrible decision. Rather than let his children live in the world, he forced them back into Gaia's womb, pushing them deep into her body, into the hidden places of the earth where light couldn't reach. Imagine that. Children born, taking their first breaths, seeing their first sky, and then being shoved back into darkness, back into cramped spaces within their mother's body. Gaia groaned under the weight and the pain of it. Her body ached with the pressure of all those hidden children, unable to emerge, unable to live. This went on for what must have felt like eternity. Each time Gaia bore a child, Uranus would come in the darkness, spreading himself over her as the sky does over the earth, and the cycle would repeat. Creation and imprisonment, birth and burial over and over. Gaia loved her children as any mother would, and the pain of their imprisonment became unbearable. But more than pain, there was rage, a deep primal fury at being used this way, at watching her children suffer, at being powerless despite being the earth itself. So she took action. In the depths of her being, Gaia forged a great sickle from adamant, that mythical metal harder than any earthly substance, grey and wickedly sharp. She called to her children still trapped within her and asked which of them had the courage to wield it against their father. Most recoiled. Uranus was the sky itself, vast and terrible. Who could stand against him? But Cronus, the youngest of the Titans, stepped forward. Cunning, ambitious Cronus, who had been waiting in that darkness, nursing his own resentments. He took the sickle from his mother, and together they hatched a plan. When Uranus came again to lie with Gaia, bringing on the night and longing for love, as Hesiod puts it, Cronus was waiting. Hidden in the darkness, crouched with the adamantine sickle gripped tight, he struck at the precise moment when his father was most vulnerable. The blade, sharp enough to cut divine flesh, severed Uranus's genitals in one swift, brutal motion. Uranus's scream must have echoed across the cosmos. The sky itself recoiled, pulling back from the earth, and in that space, that separation, the world as we know it began to take shape. No longer would sky and earth be pressed together. There would be distance now, space for life to flourish. But what of the severed parts? Cronus, in his rage and triumph, grabbed them and hurled them far out into the sea. They fell, tumbling through the air, trailing ichor, that golden blood that flows in divine veins, and splashed into the waves somewhere between Cythera and Cyprus. Now you'd think that would be the end of it. But in Greek mythology, nothing just ends. Everything transforms. Divine essence doesn't simply dissipate or die. It changes. It becomes. It births something new. The severed parts of Uranus fell into the ocean, and where they struck the water, something extraordinary began to happen. White foam started to spread across the surface of the sea. Not the gentle, delicate froth you see on beaches after a wave recedes, but something alive, something that glowed with an inner light, something that pulsed with divine power. The foam grew and swirled, gathering itself into a shape, responding to some cosmic imperative that demanded form from formlessness, being from nothingness. The sea itself seemed to respond. Waves lifted the foam, cradling it, carrying it. Fish swam in attendance beneath the surface. Dolphins leaped alongside this growing phenomenon, as if they understood that something momentous was occurring. The water became luminous, not with reflected sunlight, but with its own radiance, pink and gold and silver all at once. And from within that churning white foam, a figure began to emerge. First perhaps a hand, pale and perfect, then an arm, then shoulders, then a face that would make the sunset jealous, that would make flowers bloom, just to try to match its beauty. She rose from the sea fully formed, not as an infant, but as a woman in the peak of youth, radiant, impossibly beautiful. This was Aphrodite, born not from a womb, but from the ocean itself, from violence transformed into beauty, from severed flesh and churning water, and the mysterious alchemy that turns one thing into another. She stood there for a moment, balanced on the foam that had birthed her, water streaming from her body, her hair, long and golden or dark, depending on which poet you ask, clinging to her shoulders. The sea breeze lifted it, arranged it artfully, as if even the wind wanted to serve her. She was naked, unashamed, complete. There was no childhood for this goddess, no awkward adolescence, no learning to walk or talk or understand the world. She emerged knowing exactly what she was, exactly what she could do. The waves carried her, that's what Hesiod tells us. The foam that had birthed her became a vessel, and she rode it like a queen on a throne. The first island she approached was Cythera, a small piece of land between the Peloponnese and Crete. The moment her feet touched the shore, grass grew beneath them. Flowers sprang up where her footprints marked the sand. The island, previously ordinary, became sacred in an instant, blessed by the presence of divinity. But Cythera was only a stopping point. The waves carried her onward, eastward to the island of Cyprus. And it was there, on the beaches of Paphos, that she truly came ashore. The Horai were waiting, those goddesses of the seasons, somehow knowing that their attendance was required. They brought garments woven from light and shadow, cloths so fine they seemed to be made of captured starlight. They draped her in these shimmering fabrics, though her beauty needed no enhancement. They placed a crown of flowers on her head, myrtles and roses intertwined, and the flowers remained fresh, never wilting, forever blooming in her presence. Eros appeared as well, though whether he was her son or her companion or simply the personification of the desire she embodied depends on which version of the myth you follow. Either way, he was there, along with Himeros, the spirit of longing, and together they formed a procession. Aphrodite, attended by love and desire themselves, began her journey to Mount Olympus to take her place among the gods. As she walked or perhaps floated, because goddesses don't always follow the normal rules of locomotion, the world responded to her presence. Animals paused in their movements to watch her pass. Birds fell silent, then burst into song, more beautiful than any they'd sung before. The air itself seemed to shimmer with anticipation. This wasn't just another deity joining the ranks of the divine. This was the arrival of something fundamental, a force that would reshape how gods and mortals alike experienced the world. Her name Aphrodite was said to come from the Greek word for foam, aphros, though modern scholars think the name is older, possibly borrowed from the Near East, from goddesses like Astarte or Ishtar, who also ruled over love, fertility, and war. Aphrodite wasn't entirely a Greek invention. She was something older, something that had been worshipped under different names for longer than memory. The Greeks took her, reshaped her, and made her their own. But beneath the Hellenic polish there was always something foreign, something untamed. Cyprus became her sacred island. The city of Paphos built a great temple in her honor, and people came from across the Mediterranean to worship her. She was the goddess of love, yes, but also of the sea, of fertility, of springtime, and strangely enough, of war. Not the brutal chaos of Ares, but the strategic, seductive kind of warfare that happened in bedrooms and banquet halls. She understood that desire could be a weapon sharper than any sword. And from her very beginning, born from an act of violence, there was always a duality to Aphrodite. Beauty and blood, creation and castration, love and pain. She embodied them all. When Aphrodite arrived on Olympus, every god took notice. How could they not? She was beauty itself, desire made flesh, and her presence stirred something primal in all who saw her. The male gods in particular found themselves staring, forgetting whatever they'd been doing, whatever they'd been saying. Apollo, who prided himself on his own beauty, felt a strange mixture of admiration and envy. Hermes, always quick with words, found himself momentarily speechless. Even Hades, during one of his rare visits from the underworld, felt the pull. Zeus, ever practical and ever paranoid about conflict among his unruly family, saw a problem brewing immediately. He'd dealt with divine feuds before. He knew how quickly admiration could turn to rivalry, how easily cooperation could dissolve into competition. If every god and demigod started quarreling over Aphrodite, if alliances formed and broke over who would win her favor, Olympus would descend into chaos. The king of the gods could already see it playing out. Challenges issued, insults thrown, perhaps even violence. The last thing he needed was his pantheon tearing itself apart over a goddess, no matter how beautiful. So Zeus made an executive decision, as he was wont to do, in that authoritative way that brooked no argument. He would marry her off, remove her from the marriage market entirely, make her unavailable, problem solved. And not to one of the handsome, powerful gods like Apollo or Ares, or even Hermes, oh no. That would only invite resentment from the losers, create factions, solve nothing. Zeus gave Aphrodite to Hephaestus, and he did it without consulting her, without asking what she might want, because in Zeus's world, what Zeus decided was simply how things would be. Now let's talk about Hephaestus, because he deserves more than the dismissive treatment he often gets in these stories, reduced to the ugly god, as if that's all there was to him. Hephaestus was not without his merits. Far from it. He was the god of the forge, the divine craftsman, the master of fire and metal, and the transformation of raw materials into objects of wonder. While the other Olympians spent their time politicking and partying and interfering in mortal affairs, Hephaestus worked. He was the only god who actually produced things, who created rather than destroyed or merely presided over existing forces. His workshop was a marvel. Located either on Mount Olympus itself or beneath it, or perhaps on the volcanic island of Lemnos, depending on which version you follow, it was filled with tools beyond mortal comprehension. Automatons, mechanical beings of bronze and gold assisted him, moving with impossible grace despite being made of metal. The forge burned with fire that never went out, flames that could melt even divine metals, that could work materials no mortal smith could even touch without being incinerated. And the things Hephaestus made. Gods and heroes alike came to him for weapons and armor. He forged Zeus's thunderbolts, those weapons that could shatter mountains. He crafted Achilles' armor, so magnificent that its description takes up pages in the Iliad, depicting the entire cosmos on a shield. He built Helios's sun chariot. He created the first woman, Pandora, at Zeus's command, shaping her from clay and imbuing her with life. He could make chains that not even the mightiest could break, or jewelry so delicate it looked like captured spiderwebs. He was, without question, the most skilled craftsman in existence. But by the standards of Olympus, where physical perfection was currency and appearance often mattered more than ability, Hephaestus was considered ugly. He'd been born with a deformed foot, a twisted leg that gave him a permanent limp. His body was stocky and muscular from years of working the forge, but not in the aesthetically pleasing way that Ares or Apollo embodied. His hands were calloused and scarred from handling hot metal. He smelled of smoke and sweat, and the particular acrid scent of worked bronze. His face was often smudged with soot. The story of how he became lame varies. In one version, Hera gave birth to him and was immediately ashamed. Here was her son, deformed, imperfect, a mark of shame upon her reputation. So she threw him from Olympus, a mother casting away her infant because he didn't meet her standards of beauty. Hephaestus fell for a day and a night, tumbling through the clouds, through the sky, until he crashed into the sea near the island of Lemnos. The fall would have killed a mortal, but gods are harder to destroy. It just left him permanently injured, his leg twisted, his body broken in ways that even divine healing couldn't fully repair. In another version, it was Zeus who threw him down. During one of the many arguments between Zeus and Hera, Hephaestus made the mistake of siding with his mother. Zeus, enraged at the interference, grabbed his son and hurled him from Olympus. Same fall, same result, different cause. Either way, the message was clear. Hephaestus wasn't wanted, wasn't valued, was literally thrown away by his own parents. But here's what makes Hephaestus remarkable. He didn't stay broken. He was rescued by Thetis and Eurynome, sea goddesses who took pity on the fallen godchild. They raised him in a grotto beneath the ocean, where the sound of waves replaced the sound of divine laughter, where he was judged by what he could do rather than how he looked. And it was there, in that hidden place, that Hephaestus learned his craft. He had time, solitude, and motivation. He taught himself to work metal, to understand fire, to transform one thing into another. He became skilled not because it was his divine nature, but because it was what he had. The one thing that made him valuable. When he finally returned to Olympus years later, he came not as a supplicant begging to be taken back, but as an artisan offering his services. He brought gifts, magnificent creations that made even the gods gasp. Zeus, seeing the value in having such a skilled craftsman on hand, accepted him back. Hephaestus had earned his place among the Olympians not through birth or beauty, but through skill. It was, in its way, a triumph, but it was also lonely. The other gods respected his work, but not necessarily him. They commissioned pieces from him, praised his craftsmanship, but they didn't invite him to their parties, didn't include him in their social circles. He remained somewhat apart, more comfortable in his forge than in the halls of Olympus. So when Zeus decreed that Aphrodite would be his wife, Hephaestus must have felt a complicated mixture of emotions. Triumph, certainly. Here was validation of a sort, the king of the gods himself arranging for Hephaestus to marry the most beautiful goddess in existence. It said something, didn't it? That he was worthy after all, that his place among the Olympians was secure, that perhaps beauty and skill could be partners. But also trepidation, because Hephaestus knew what he looked like. He knew what Aphrodite looked like, and he knew that she had no say in this arrangement, that Zeus had commanded it, and she had simply been forced to comply. What bride wants a husband chosen by someone else's decree, especially when that husband is everything she is not? Aphrodite certainly didn't want it. She had no say in the matter, no voice in the decision that would determine her marital status for eternity. Zeus commanded, and so it was done, as simple and as brutal as that. She went through with the marriage because refusing a direct order from the king of the gods wasn't really an option. She wore the wedding garlands, probably woven from roses and myrtle in her honor. She accepted the rings Hephaestus crafted with his own hands, each one a small masterpiece of delicate metalwork, set with gems that caught the light like captured stars. She stood beside him, while vows were spoken and oaths were taken, and the other gods watched with expressions ranging from amusement to sympathy to barely concealed schadenfreude, but she was never happy about it. The match was absurd on its face, and everyone knew it. He spent his days covered in soot and grime, working the forge, hammering metal into submission, building things with his hands. The heat of the forge left his skin perpetually flushed, his hair singed at the ends, his clothes smelling of smoke. She spent hers draped in silk and linen so fine it was nearly transparent, surrounded by flowers that never wilted, inspiring poets and painters and anyone who happened to glimpse her. He smelled of smoke and sweat and hot metal. She smelled of roses and the sea and something indefinable that made hearts beat faster. He was grounded, practical, steady, the kind of person who solved problems by working through them methodically. She was mercurial, passionate, untamable, the kind of being who created problems and solved them and created new ones with equal enthusiasm. They had nothing in common except their divine status, and that was hardly enough to build a marriage on. Hephaestus tried, though. He truly did. You can't fault his effort. He showered her with gifts, each one more beautiful than the last, each one crafted with meticulous care. He made her jewelry that sparkled with impossible light, necklaces that seemed to be woven from captured sunbeams, bracelets so delicate they looked like they might shatter at a touch, but were actually unbreakable. He crafted furniture of gold and silver, chairs that adjusted themselves to be perfectly comfortable, mirrors that showed not just your reflection, but your best possible reflection. He even built automatons specifically to attend to her needs, mechanical servants that could bring her whatever she wanted without her having to ask. But here's the thing about love and marriage. You can't forge them the way you forge a sword. You can't hammer out the imperfections and smooth away the rough edges and create something perfect through skill and effort alone. Love requires mutuality, requires choice, requires something that can't be manufactured in a workshop, no matter how talented the craftsman. Aphrodite remained distant. She was polite, probably. She accepted the gifts with the appropriate words of thanks. She didn't openly insult him or refuse to acknowledge him. But she was never warm, never affectionate, never showed any sign that she felt for him what he so clearly felt for her. She fulfilled the letter of her marital obligations, but not the spirit, and both of them knew it. So while Hephaestus worked his forge, Aphrodite turned her gaze elsewhere. And where her gaze fell, trouble followed. If Hephaestus represented everything stable and productive, Ares represented the opposite. He was the god of war, not the strategic kind that Athena favored, but the raw, bloody chaos of battle. Where Athena planned, Ares charged. Where she brought discipline, he brought frenzy. He was violence personified, tall, muscular, fierce, often depicted covered in the blood of his enemies. Even his fellow Olympians didn't particularly like him. Zeus once told him he was the most hateful of all the gods, which is saying something in a family that included Hera's vindictiveness and Dionysus's madness. But Aphrodite saw something in Ares that others missed, or perhaps she simply didn't care what others thought. There was a magnetism between them, an attraction of opposites that made perfect, dangerous sense. Love and war have always been intertwined. Desire and conquest, passion and violence. They're two sides of the same coin, and Aphrodite and Ares embodied that duality. Their affair began quietly, or as quietly as anything involving two major deities could be. When Hephaestus was away at his forge, Ares would visit. They were careful at first, or thought they were, but secrets among the gods rarely stay secret for long. Helios, the sun god, saw everything. It was literally his job, his purpose, his function in the cosmic order. Each day he drove his golden chariot across the sky from east to west, pulled by fire-breathing horses whose hooves sparked against the clouds. From his vantage point high above the world, nothing that happened in the daylight escaped his notice. He saw farmers tending their fields, sailors navigating by the stars, merchants haggling in marketplaces. He saw crimes committed and oaths broken and lovers meeting in supposedly secret places. The sun sees all, and Helios was the sun. So of course he witnessed Ares and Aphrodite together, perhaps multiple times on multiple occasions, until even he felt obligated to say something. One day, he saw them in Aphrodite's chambers, in what should have been the marital home she shared with Hephaestus, tangled in an embrace that left absolutely no doubt about the nature of their relationship. They weren't just talking. They weren't just friends, spending innocent time together. The scene was explicit enough that even Helios, who was not exactly known for his moral judgments, apparently decided enough was enough. Helios left his chariot in the care of his daughters, the Heliades, and went straight to Hephaestus's workshop. He found the smith god at his forge as usual, hammer in hand, working on some intricate piece of metalwork that required his complete attention. The forge was roaring, the heat immense, the air shimmering with waves of thermal distortion. Hephaestus's automatons moved about their tasks, clanging and whirring, a symphony of bronze and fire. Helios waited until there was a break in the work, until Hephaestus set down his hammer and wiped the sweat from his brow. Then he told him everything. "Your wife," Helios said, "and Ares. In your home. In your bed, most likely. I've seen them more than once. I thought you should know." The words must have struck Hephaestus like physical blows. Whatever he'd been making, whatever project had consumed his attention, suddenly didn't matter. His wife, the goddess he'd showered with gifts, the one he'd tried so hard to please, was betraying him with his brother, with Ares of all gods, the most hateful of the Olympians, the one everyone merely tolerated. That's who Aphrodite preferred over him. Now if you're expecting Hephaestus to fly into a rage, to grab his hammer and storm off to confront Ares in single combat, to challenge the god of war to a duel over his wife's honor, you'd be mistaken. That kind of hot-blooded reaction would have been more Ares' style, or maybe Apollo's. But Hephaestus wasn't that kind of god. He was methodical, he was patient, he was clever. And when you're the god of the forge, when your entire existence is built around transforming raw materials into finished products through careful planning and precise execution, you don't fight with swords. You fight with inventions. Hephaestus thanked Helios for the information, his voice probably carefully neutral, betraying nothing of what he felt inside. Then he returned to his forge. But now he wasn't working on whatever commission or project had occupied him before. Now he had a new goal, a new creation to bring into being. Revenge, but the clever kind, the kind that would expose the lovers and humiliate them as thoroughly as they'd humiliated him. He spent days on this project, maybe weeks. Time moves differently for immortals, and Hephaestus was nothing if not thorough. He crafted a net from the finest golden chains, links so delicate they were almost invisible to the naked eye, catching the light in ways that made them seem more like spiderwebs than metalwork. But these weren't ordinary chains. They were divine creations, unbreakable even to the strongest of gods. Ares, with all his might, couldn't snap them. Zeus himself probably couldn't break them if he tried. They were perfection in the form of a trap, a masterpiece of smithcraft dedicated to a single purpose, catching the unfaithful in the act. Hephaestus took this net and rigged it above his marital bed with careful precision. It was suspended from the ceiling, held by mechanisms so clever they'd remain hidden until the moment they were triggered. The net would fall at the slightest pressure on the bed, cascading down to entrap whoever was there. It was set, armed, waiting. All Hephaestus needed now was bait, and the bait would provide itself. He went to Aphrodite and announced that he was leaving. Business on Lemnos, he might have said. Commissions to complete. He'd be gone for several days, perhaps longer. She probably nodded, expressed the appropriate wifely concern, asked if he needed anything before he left. He declined. Kissed her forehead maybe, a chaste gesture that probably stung with irony. Then he left, very publicly, making sure word spread throughout Olympus that Hephaestus was away. But of course, he didn't actually go anywhere. He stayed nearby, hidden, watching, waiting. Aphrodite, assuming the coast was clear, sent word to Ares. The message was probably simple, unnecessary even. Ares knew when Hephaestus was gone. He'd probably been waiting for exactly this opportunity, counting the hours until he could visit without risking discovery. The moment he received confirmation, he came to Aphrodite's chambers, eager as always, ready to spend time with the goddess he actually wanted to be with. They retired to the bedroom, to that same bed where Aphrodite technically slept with her husband, though probably with as much distance between them as possible. But now she was with Ares, and the contrast must have been stark. Where Hephaestus was careful and tentative, Ares was bold and passionate. Where one approached with uncertainty, the other approached with confidence. They fell onto the bed together, finally alone, finally free to be themselves without hiding or pretending. The moment their weight hit the mattress, mechanisms clicked, springs released. The golden net cascaded down from above like a falling spider's web, so fast they had no time to react. 1 second they were embracing, the next they were trapped, tangled together in chains so fine they were almost invisible, but so strong they were inescapable. The net wrapped around them, binding them together in their most intimate moment, holding them frozen in an embrace that had suddenly become a prison. They struggled immediately, of course. Ares, the god of war, strength personified, pulled at the chains with all his might. They didn't budge. They didn't even strain. Hephaestus had forged them too well. Aphrodite tried to slip free, but the net only tightened, responding to movement by contracting further. They were caught, truly caught, and there was nothing they could do about it. Hephaestus retreated to his workshop and got to work. He spent days, maybe weeks, crafting something new. It looked like nothing special, just a net of fine golden chains, so delicate they were almost invisible, so strong they were unbreakable. He took this net and rigged it above his marriage bed, hidden, waiting. Then he announced to Aphrodite that he was leaving for Lemnos, his old refuge, for several days. She expressed the appropriate wifely concern, and the moment he was gone, she sent word to Ares. The war god arrived quickly, eager as always, and they retired to the bedroom. Then came the worst part. The doors flew open, and Hephaestus stood there, no longer hiding, no longer waiting in the shadows. Behind him came other gods, summoned by him, invited to witness this moment. Zeus wasn't there. Some accounts say he declined out of a sense of propriety, or perhaps just to avoid the awkwardness. But many others came, drawn by curiosity or schadenfreude, or simple disbelief that this was actually happening. Apollo arrived, ever beautiful, his golden curls perfectly arranged despite having presumably rushed over. Hermes showed up, his expression somewhere between amusement and sympathy, because Hermes understood secrets and lies better than most, and probably wasn't entirely surprised by this revelation. Poseidon came, his face harder to read, the lord of the sea who'd had his own share of complicated relationships. Dionysus wandered in, wine cup in hand, looking like this was the most entertaining thing he'd seen in decades. The goddesses interestingly declined to attend, whether out of modesty, solidarity with Aphrodite, or simply because they found the whole spectacle distasteful. Hera stayed away. Athena stayed away. Artemis, who would have been horrified by the entire situation, definitely stayed away. But the male gods came in numbers, and they stood around the trapped lovers, staring at what Hephaestus had so cleverly revealed. The scene must have been surreal. Aphrodite, the most beautiful goddess in existence, naked and trapped, unable to cover herself or escape or maintain any dignity. Ares, the mighty war god who claimed to fear nothing, rendered powerless by some golden chains, caught in the most compromising possible position. Both of them exposed literally and figuratively, their secret laid bare for anyone to see. Hephaestus stood at the front, and for once he wasn't in the background. He wasn't the ugly god everyone overlooked. He wasn't the craftsman they only noticed when they needed something made. He was center stage, the wronged husband who'd outsmarted his wife and her lover, who'd turned humiliation into triumph through sheer cleverness. He addressed the assembled gods, his voice probably shaking with emotion but also with righteous anger. "Look at them," he might have said. "Look at how they've honored their marriage vows. Look at how they've rewarded my devotion and my gifts. My wife, given to me by Zeus himself, and my brother here in my own bed, mocking me while I worked to provide for them." The reactions among the watching gods were mixed. Some were outraged on Hephaestus's behalf. This was a clear violation not just of marriage, but of hospitality, of brotherhood, of the basic codes that governed even divine behavior. Others tried not to laugh because, despite the serious nature of the betrayal, there was something absurd about the situation. The mighty Ares, who boasted of never retreating, couldn't escape some golden chains. Aphrodite, who'd used her beauty to manipulate countless others, was now the one being displayed. Apollo, according to one account, turned to Hermes and made a joke. "Would you accept being in that position," he asked, "even trapped in chains and exposed to everyone, if it meant lying with Aphrodite?" The question was crude but honest, acknowledging what everyone was thinking. Despite the humiliation, despite being caught, Ares had what many gods wanted: Aphrodite's affection, her passion, her genuine desire. Hermes, never one to pass up a good quip, reportedly answered without hesitation. "3 times as many chains," he said. "Let every god and goddess come to watch." Even then, he'd gladly trade places with Ares. It was a joke, probably, or mostly a joke. But it also spoke to Aphrodite's power, that even trapped and humiliated, she was still desirable, still the embodiment of what every being craved. Not everyone laughed, though. Poseidon, watching the scene with the weight of experience behind his gaze, felt something else. Perhaps pity for Hephaestus, who'd been driven to such elaborate revenge. Perhaps concern for what would happen next, because divine conflicts had a way of escalating. He stepped forward and addressed his nephew. "Hephaestus," he said, "you've made your point. Everyone has seen. The betrayal is witnessed and confirmed. But you can't keep them trapped forever. Release them, and I promise Ares will face consequences for his actions." It was a reasonable request, but Hephaestus wasn't feeling reasonable. He'd been humiliated for how long? Days? Weeks? Months? While everyone on Olympus probably knew or suspected what was happening, while Aphrodite and Ares conducted their affair behind his back, laughing at him most likely. Why should he show mercy now? But Poseidon was insistent. He was the sea god, older and more powerful than Hephaestus, and his word carried weight. He gave guarantees, made promises about restitution and consequences. Other gods added their voices, some sympathetic to Hephaestus, but also uncomfortable with this prolonged display. Eventually, whether out of respect for Poseidon or simple weariness, Hephaestus agreed. He released the mechanism. The golden net retracted, pulled back by the same clever engineering that had deployed it. Ares and Aphrodite scrambled apart, grabbing for clothes, for dignity, for any way to escape this situation with some measure of grace. There was none to be found. The scandal rocked Olympus for a while, but divine memory is short, or perhaps divine scandals are simply too frequent to dwell on anyone for long. Hephaestus and Aphrodite's marriage effectively ended that day. In some accounts they divorced, in others they simply lived separate lives, the marriage existing only in name. But Aphrodite and Ares, they didn't end. Despite the humiliation, despite the divine laughter, their relationship continued. Perhaps the public shaming only intensified the bond between them. Or perhaps love, real or otherwise, doesn't bow to shame. From their union came several children. Eros, the god of love himself in some versions, Phobos and Deimos, fear and terror, who rode with their father into battle, Harmonia, the goddess of harmony, which is deeply ironic considering her parents' chaotic relationship, and Anteros, requited love's counterpart to Eros's initial strike of passion. These children embodied different aspects of their parents' natures. Eros brought desire, the beginning of love. Phobos and Deimos brought the visceral reactions of battle, the terror that accompanies violence. Harmonia brought balance, the peace that comes after conflict. Together they represented the spectrum of human emotion, all born from the union of love and war. The affair between Aphrodite and Ares became one of the most famous scandals in Greek mythology, retold in poems, painted on vases, whispered about in temples. It showed the gods at their most human, caught between desire and duty, passion and propriety. And it established something fundamental about Aphrodite. She would not be controlled, not by Zeus's decree, not by marriage vows, not by social expectations. She was the goddess of love, and love, by its nature, cannot be caged. If we're being honest, many of the great disasters in Greek mythology can be traced back to someone's wounded pride, to a slight that seemed minor at the time, but snowballed into catastrophe. The Greeks understood the power of resentment, how a small insult could fester and grow until it consumed everything around it. This particular disaster began at a wedding, because of course it did. Weddings in Greek myths are rarely the joyous affairs they're supposed to be. They're powder kegs wrapped in garlands, celebrations waiting to explode, gatherings of beings with too much power and too little impulse control, all confined to one space. The wedding in question was between Peleus and Thetis, and it should have been a celebration for the ages. Peleus was a mortal hero, renowned for his bravery and skill, one of the Argonauts who'd sailed with Jason in search of the Golden Fleece. Thetis was a sea nymph, a Nereid, daughter of Nereus, the Old Man of the Sea. She was beautiful beyond description, graceful, desirable. So desirable, in fact, that both Zeus and Poseidon had pursued her romantically, competing for her affections in the way that gods do, which is to say with very little concern for what she actually wanted. But then came a prophecy, as prophecies do, always at the most inconvenient moments. The seer Themis revealed that any son born to Thetis would be greater than his father, greater in power, in glory, in everything that mattered. Zeus, hearing this and being Zeus, immediately understood the implications. If he had a son with Thetis, that son would eventually surpass him, would potentially overthrow him the way Zeus had overthrown his own father Cronus. The cycle would continue. The prophecy was too dangerous to ignore. So Zeus, in what he probably considered a masterfully clever solution, decided to marry Thetis off to a mortal. The son of a mortal man could be great, could be a legendary hero even, but he could never threaten the throne of Olympus. Problem solved, destiny averted, crisis managed. That Thetis might have opinions about being used as a pawn in divine politics apparently didn't factor into the decision. Thetis, being a goddess of sorts herself with power over the sea and the ability to change her shape at will, didn't want to marry a mortal. When Peleus first tried to claim her, she resisted, transforming into fire, into water, into a lion, into a serpent, cycling through forms to escape his grasp. But Peleus persisted, holding on through all her transformations until she finally yielded. Whether this was romantic determination or simply exhaustion on her part has been debated, but either way the marriage was arranged. The wedding took place on Mount Pelion in Thessaly, and it was grand. All the gods were invited because this was, in essence, a political event as much as a romantic one. Zeus wanted to ensure that everyone understood and accepted this arrangement, that there would be no challenges or conflicts over Thetis. The Olympians came in their finery, bringing gifts that were lavish, even by divine standards. The Muses sang, their voices creating harmonies that mortals could only dream of. The centaur Chiron, wise and educated, attended to represent his kind. The celebrations were everything a divine wedding should be: magnificent, excessive, full of the kind of splendor that only immortals could produce. But there was one goddess who didn't receive an invitation. Eris, the goddess of discord and strife, the personification of conflict itself, was deliberately left off the guest list. Now you might think this was reasonable. After all, who invites the goddess of discord to a wedding? Her entire purpose, her fundamental nature, was to cause trouble, to sow division, to turn harmony into chaos. Inviting her to a celebration dedicated to unity and love would be like inviting a lit torch to a grain warehouse. It seemed like common sense to exclude her, except the Greeks understood something important about gods, especially about gods who embodied fundamental forces. You couldn't just ignore them and hope they'd go away. Eris wasn't just some troublemaker who could be safely excluded from social events. She was discord itself, and discord has a way of showing up whether you invite it or not. By explicitly not inviting her, by making it clear that she was unwelcome, the wedding planners, whoever they were, had essentially guaranteed that she would appear. And she would be angry. Eris arrived at the celebration uninvited, unexpected, and bearing a gift. She didn't storm in dramatically or announce herself with thunder. That wasn't her style. Discord works best when it's subtle, when it plants seeds that grow into conflicts without anyone quite understanding how it all started. She simply appeared among the festivities, unnoticed at first, just another figure at a crowded celebration. In her hand she carried a golden apple. Not just any apple, but one that gleamed with an otherworldly luster, polished to perfection, beautiful in a way that immediately caught the eye. And on this apple, inscribed in letters that seemed to shift and shimmer, were 3 words: "To the fairest," or in some translations, "for the most beautiful." Simple words, devastating words. Words designed to create exactly the kind of conflict Eris thrived on. She didn't present the apple to anyone. She didn't announce what it was for or who should receive it. She simply tossed it into the crowd of celebrating gods, let it roll across the floor of wherever this feast was taking place, gleaming and beautiful and impossible to ignore, those 3 words visible to everyone who looked at it. Then she vanished, her work done, the trap set. Discord didn't need to stick around to watch the chaos unfold. It would unfold whether she was there or not. The apple rolled across the banquet hall floor, catching the light, and conversation stopped. Gods paused mid-sentence. Goddesses turned to look. Everyone saw it. And more importantly, everyone saw what was written on it. To the fairest, an award, a prize, a declaration that one among them was more beautiful than all the others. And 3 goddesses reached for it simultaneously, as if drawn by invisible strings, as if the apple called to something fundamental in their natures. Hera, queen of the gods, wife of Zeus, patron of marriage and sovereignty. Athena, goddess of wisdom and warfare, Zeus's favorite daughter, born from his head in full armor. And Aphrodite, goddess of love and beauty itself, the foam-born, whose very purpose was to embody physical perfection and desire. Each goddess believed herself to be the fairest. How could they not? Each had her own claim, her own form of beauty, her own reason to believe the apple was meant for her. The other gods wisely stepped back. No one wanted to judge a beauty contest between these 3. Choose Hera, and you insulted the patron of civilization and war. Choose Athena, and you scorned the queen of heaven herself. Choose Aphrodite, and the other 2 would make you regret it. This was a losing proposition, no matter which way you turned. Zeus, showing rare wisdom, refused to judge. He declared that a mortal should decide, someone who couldn't be intimidated or swayed by divine politics. And he knew just the mortal for the job. On the slopes of Mount Ida, near Troy, there lived a shepherd who was more than he seemed. His name was Paris, and though he tended flocks and lived simply, he was actually a prince of Troy, son of King Priam and Queen Hecuba. He'd been abandoned as an infant because of a prophecy that he would bring destruction to his city, but he'd survived and grown into a young man of considerable good looks and, apparently, adequate judgment. Zeus sent Hermes, the messenger god, to bring the 3 goddesses to Paris and let him decide which one deserved the apple. One can only imagine Paris's shock when 3 goddesses appeared before him, each more magnificent than anything he'd ever seen. They didn't stand on ceremony. This was a competition, and each goddess was determined to win. Hera went first. She offered Paris power. She could make him king of all Europe and Asia, ruler of the greatest empire the world had ever seen. Wealth, dominion, armies at his command, he would want for nothing. Athena offered wisdom and prowess in battle. She would make him the greatest warrior who ever lived, undefeated in combat, remembered for all time as a hero. glory eternal. That was her gift. Aphrodite, however, took a different approach. She leaned close and whispered her offer. She would give him the love of the most beautiful woman in the world, Helen of Sparta, daughter of Zeus and Leda, whose beauty was said to be divine. Helen would be his, and their love would be legendary. Paris, who was young and romantic and clearly not thinking about long-term consequences, who probably couldn't see past the immediate promise of requited love and legendary beauty, chose Aphrodite. He handed her the golden apple, declaring her the fairest of the three, the most beautiful goddess in existence. The moment had weight beyond what Paris probably understood. He wasn't just picking the prettiest goddess, wasn't just settling a beauty contest. He was choosing between three fundamental visions of what made life worth living. Hera had offered him power, the ability to shape the world through authority and command. That was one kind of life, the life of a king, a conqueror, someone whose name would be written in the chronicles of great rulers. Athena had offered glory, the eternal fame that came from being the best at what you do, from achieving excellence that future generations would remember and aspire to. That was another kind of life, the hero's path, carved out through skill and courage. But Aphrodite offered love. Not the abstract concept, but the specific reality of Helen, who was said to be the most beautiful mortal woman alive, whose beauty was so renowned that men across Greece had once competed to marry her. Aphrodite was offering Paris the experience of genuine passion, of being loved by someone extraordinary, of feeling what poets write about and singers celebrate. In choosing her, Paris was saying that love mattered more than power, that desire was more valuable than glory, that the personal was more important than the political. It was in its way an idealistic choice, a romantic's choice, the kind of decision that makes sense when you're young and haven't yet learned that actions have consequences that ripple outward far beyond what you intended. Aphrodite accepted the apple with a smile that could have melted glaciers, radiant and triumphant. She had won. She was officially declared the fairest, the most beautiful, validated in her claim by an impartial judge who had no reason to favor one goddess over another. The victory was sweet, complete, exactly what she'd wanted from the moment Eris threw that apple onto the banquet floor. But Hera and Athena did not smile. They did not graciously congratulate the winner. They did not accept this judgment with good humor, or even resigned acceptance. Instead, they left Mount Ida in cold fury, their faces set in expressions that promised retribution. Paris had insulted them, rejected them, declared them inferior to Aphrodite. And gods do not forget insults. More importantly, gods do not forgive them. From that moment on, Hera and Athena became implacable enemies of Troy. Not just of Paris, though he was certainly at the top of their list, but of his entire city, his family, his people. When divine beings hold grudges, they don't limit their revenge to the person who wronged them. They expand it, make it generational, turn it into something that affects hundreds or thousands of innocent people. Troy would burn because Paris chose the wrong goddess in a beauty contest. The entire civilization would fall because a shepherd prince preferred love to power or glory. The judgment had consequences, immediate and far-reaching, though at that moment Paris didn't care, couldn't care. He had the favor of the goddess of love, and she had promised him Helen. That was all that mattered to him in that instant, standing on Mount Ida with an apple in his hand, and three goddesses watching him with very different expressions. Aphrodite's delight, Hera's rage, Athena's cold, calculating anger. He'd made his choice, and there was no taking it back. Aphrodite, true to her word and her nature, immediately began arranging everything. She didn't just promise Helen and leave Paris to figure out the details himself. No, she took an active role, manipulating events and emotions with the skill of someone who'd been doing this for eons. First, Paris would need to actually meet Helen, which meant traveling to Sparta. So Aphrodite arranged for Priam, king of Troy, to finally acknowledge Paris as his son. Remember, Paris had been abandoned as an infant because of a prophecy that he would destroy Troy. He'd been raised by shepherds, living a simple life on the slopes of Mount Ida. But now, suddenly, he was welcomed back into the royal family, recognized as a prince, given status and resources. With his newfound position, Paris could travel as a diplomat, as a representative of Troy, someone who could be received by foreign kings without suspicion. He sailed to Sparta with an entourage, bearing gifts, officially on a mission of friendship and political alliance. Menelaus, king of Sparta and Helen's husband, welcomed him as a guest, as was required by the laws of hospitality that governed civilized society. These were sacred laws, violations of which angered the gods themselves. A host was obligated to protect and provide for his guests. A guest was obligated to respect his host and his host's household. These weren't just social niceties. They were fundamental to how the Greek world functioned. Paris entered Menelaus's palace as an honored guest. He ate at the king's table. He slept under the king's roof. He was shown every courtesy and kindness. And all the while, Aphrodite was working her magic, quite literally. She bent Helen's perception, stirred her emotions, made her see Paris not as just another visiting diplomat, but as something special, someone extraordinary. Whether Helen would have been attracted to Paris anyway, we'll never know. Aphrodite didn't leave it to chance. She ensured that when Helen looked at this young Trojan prince, she felt desire, attraction, a pull so strong it overrode reason and duty and every obligation she had. There was just one small problem, one detail that Paris had somehow overlooked or simply chosen to ignore in his excitement over winning the contest and earning Aphrodite's favor. Helen was already married. She was the queen of Sparta, wed to King Menelaus in a ceremony that had been one of the most significant political events of the previous generation. More than that, her marriage was protected by oaths. When Helen had come of age, and her father Tyndareus needed to choose a husband for her from among dozens of suitors, he'd been faced with a problem. How do you pick one man without offending all the others? How do you avoid creating enemies when every rejected suitor would feel slighted? Tyndareus, following advice from Odysseus, had required all the suitors to swear an oath. They would accept his choice of husband for Helen, whoever it was. And more than that, they would defend that marriage if anyone ever tried to violate it. Every man who'd sought Helen's hand had sworn this oath, binding themselves to protect her marriage, even if they didn't win her for themselves. It was a clever solution that had diffused a potentially explosive situation. But it also meant that Helen's marriage was backed not just by Menelaus's personal strength, but by the collective might of every major king and hero in Greece. Breaking that marriage would trigger that oath. It would bring all of those warriors down on whoever had violated it. Paris either didn't know this or didn't care. Aphrodite had promised him Helen, and he intended to claim her, consequences be damned. Whether what happened next was abduction or elopement has been debated for millennia. Ancient sources differ on whether Helen went willingly or whether Paris took her by force. Some versions portray her as a willing participant, swept up in passion created by Aphrodite, choosing Paris over Menelaus despite knowing it was wrong. Other versions present her as a victim, stolen away against her will with no choice in the matter. The truth, if there even is a singular truth in mythology, is probably lost to time. But either way, the result was the same. When Menelaus returned from a trip, called away conveniently at just the right time through Aphrodite's manipulation of events, he found his wife gone. Helen had left with Paris, sailing away to Troy, and she'd taken treasures with her, gold and jewelry from the palace storerooms, making this not just a personal betrayal, but a political and economic crime. Paris hadn't just stolen Menelaus's wife. He'd violated the sacred laws of hospitality, repaid kindness with treachery, and committed what amounted to an act of war. And Menelaus, finding his wife gone, did what any self-respecting Greek king would do. He called for war. All the kings of Greece had once sworn an oath to defend Helen's marriage, back when her father Tyndareus had to choose a husband for her from among dozens of suitors. That oath now came due. Menelaus's brother Agamemnon assembled the greatest military expedition Greece had ever seen. 1,000 ships, perhaps more, set sail for Troy. The Trojan War began not with a sword or a spear, but with an apple. And Aphrodite, having won her beauty contest, would now watch as that victory tore the ancient world apart. The Trojan War lasted 10 years, 10 years of siege, of blood on Trojan soil, of heroes dying and cities burning. And through it all, Aphrodite remained deeply involved. This was her war, in a sense. She had promised Helen to Paris, and she intended to keep that promise no matter the cost. The Greeks had heroes. Achilles, the greatest warrior of his generation, whose rage would become legendary. Ajax, strong as an ox, immovable as a mountain. Odysseus, clever enough to outwit gods. Diomedes, fierce in battle, favored by Athena. And of course, Menelaus, whose stolen wife was the entire reason for the conflict. The Trojans had heroes too. Hector, Paris's older brother, noble and brave, the true defender of Troy. Aeneas, son of Aphrodite herself, destined to survive the war and found a new nation. And Paris, the man who had started it all, handsome and charming, but not nearly the warrior his brother was. The gods took sides. Hera and Athena, still furious about losing the beauty contest, supported the Greeks with everything they had. Apollo and Ares sided with Troy. Poseidon wavered, his loyalties shifting like the tides. And Aphrodite, naturally, stood with Troy, protecting Paris and her son Aeneas whenever she could. The war had countless moments of drama. Achilles fought and killed Hector, dragging his body around Troy's walls in a display of rage and grief. Patroclus died in Achilles' armor, leading to the hero's return to battle. Ajax and Odysseus quarreled over armor. The war ground on, brutal and seemingly endless. But one particular incident illustrates just how involved Aphrodite became in the mortal conflict. Early in the war, before things turned truly bloody, Paris and Menelaus agreed to settle the matter through single combat. The winner would take Helen, and the war would end. It seemed reasonable. Both armies drew back and watched as the two men faced each other. Menelaus was the better warrior, everyone knew it. Paris was skilled enough, but he was no match for the wronged husband whose rage fueled every strike. The duel went as expected. Menelaus battered Paris, beating him down, and finally grabbed him by the helmet, dragging him across the battlefield. Paris was moments away from death or capture, the war about to end before it truly began. Then Aphrodite intervened. She snapped the strap of Paris's helmet, leaving Menelaus holding empty headgear. Then she wrapped Paris in a divine mist and spirited him away, depositing him safely in his bedchamber in Troy. Just like that, Paris was gone, saved by his patron goddess. But Aphrodite wasn't finished. She appeared to Helen, who was watching the duel from the walls of Troy, and commanded her to go to Paris's chamber. Helen, seeing through the disguise, recognized the goddess and initially refused. She'd just watched Paris lose the duel. Why should she go to a man who couldn't even fight for her? Aphrodite's response was swift and terrifying. The goddess dropped her gentle facade and threatened Helen directly. She could make Helen as hated as she was loved. She could turn every Trojan and every Greek against her. Helen, faced with the raw power of an angry goddess, complied. This incident shows Aphrodite at her most manipulative. She didn't just influence events, she controlled them. She saved Paris when he should have died. She compelled Helen when Helen resisted. The war, which might have ended that day, continued because Aphrodite willed it so. But the goddess wasn't invincible. During another battle, Aphrodite came to the aid of her son Aeneas, who was wounded and about to be killed by Diomedes. She wrapped him in her arms and began to carry him from the battlefield. Athena, watching this, was furious. She whispered to Diomedes, urging him to strike, and the mortal hero, emboldened by the goddess of wisdom, turned his spear on Aphrodite herself. The spear bit into her wrist, piercing divine flesh. Ichor, the golden blood of the gods, spilled onto the battlefield. Aphrodite screamed, a sound that echoed across the plain, and dropped Aeneas. Apollo quickly stepped in to rescue the Trojan hero, while Aphrodite fled the battlefield in agony and humiliation. She returned to Olympus in tears, seeking comfort from her mother Dione, who tended her wound and reminded her that mortals had dared to harm gods before. The wound healed quickly, as divine wounds do, but the humiliation lasted longer. Aphrodite learned that day that even gods could bleed when they ventured too close to mortal conflicts. The war continued, grinding both sides down. Eventually the Greeks won through cleverness rather than strength. The famous Trojan horse designed by Odysseus allowed warriors to infiltrate the city. Troy burned. Priam was killed. Paris fell to an arrow. Hector was already dead. The great city, which had stood for generations, fell in a single night. But Aeneas survived, guided by his mother Aphrodite, who showed him the path to escape with his father and son. From the ashes of Troy, Aeneas would eventually sail to Italy, where his descendants would found Rome. So in a way, even in Troy's destruction, Aphrodite ensured that something of the city would endure. The Trojan War became the defining event of Greek mythology, inspiring Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, influencing art and literature for millennia. And at the heart of it all, wrapped in the tragedy and the glory, was a single goddess who had simply wanted to win a beauty contest. The cost of her vanity was almost incalculable, but then again Aphrodite never claimed to be a goddess of wisdom or restraint. She was the goddess of desire, and desire always demands its price. Not all of Aphrodite's stories involve grand wars or divine scandals. Some are simpler, quieter, and perhaps all the more heartbreaking for it. The story of Adonis is one such tale. It's a myth about love and loss, about the cycle of the seasons, and about the rare occasion when even the goddess of love found herself powerless. It begins, as many Greek myths do, with a curse born from pride. There was once a king named Cinyras who ruled Cyprus. He had a daughter named Myrrha, and like many fathers, he boasted about her. But Cinyras made the fatal error of comparing his daughter's beauty to that of Aphrodite herself. This was never wise. The gods tolerated many things, but disrespect wasn't one of them. Aphrodite, hearing the boast, decided to teach Cinyras a lesson through the most horrific method imaginable. She afflicted Myrrha with an unnatural passion, a burning, shameful desire for her own father. Myrrha, horrified by her own feelings, tried to resist. She knew her desire was wrong, cursed, impossible, but Aphrodite's will was not easily defied. The goddess had wound the curse tight, and Myrrha could not escape it. With the help of her nurse, Myrrha managed to deceive her father. During a festival when Cinyras was drunk on wine, the nurse brought Myrrha to his bed in darkness, telling him only that a young woman desired him. Cinyras, none the wiser, accepted. For several nights this continued until one night Cinyras brought a lamp to see the face of his mysterious lover. The revelation shattered him. Seeing his own daughter in his bed, understanding what had happened, Cinyras flew into a rage. He drew his sword and chased Myrrha from the palace, intent on killing both her and the child she now carried in her womb. Myrrha ran until she could run no more. At the edge of the kingdom, exhausted and despairing, she prayed. She asked the gods to remove her from the world of the living, but not send her to the realm of the dead. She wanted to exist nowhere, to fade into something that couldn't suffer. The gods, for once showing mercy, granted her wish. They transformed her into a myrrh tree. Her tears became the resin that dripped from the bark, forever weeping. And there she stood, rooted and silent, until the time came for her child to be born. When the moment arrived, the bark of the tree split open. From within emerged a baby boy, perfect and beautiful beyond measure. His name was Adonis. Aphrodite, seeing the child, felt something shift inside her. Perhaps she felt guilt for the curse that had led to his creation. Perhaps she simply saw his beauty and wanted to possess it. Either way, she took the infant and hid him away in a chest, which she then gave to Persephone, queen of the underworld, asking her to guard him. But when Persephone opened the chest and saw the beautiful child, she too fell in love with him. She raised Adonis in the underworld, and when he grew into a stunningly handsome young man, she refused to return him to Aphrodite. The two goddesses quarreled, neither willing to give him up. Eventually Zeus intervened. He decreed that Adonis would spend 4 months of the year with Aphrodite, 4 months with Persephone, and 4 months wherever he chose. Adonis, given the choice, always chose to spend his 4 months with Aphrodite. Some say this division of the year mirrors the agricultural cycle, with Adonis's time in the underworld representing winter and his return bringing spring. During the months when Adonis was with her, Aphrodite was happier than perhaps she'd ever been. She genuinely loved him, not with the passionate chaos of her affair with Ares, but with something softer, more tender. She spent her days with him, walking through forests, lying in meadows of flowers. For once, she wasn't playing games or manipulating mortals. She was simply in love. But Adonis was a hunter. He lived for the thrill of the chase, for the challenge of tracking boars and deer through the wilderness. Aphrodite worried about this. She warned him repeatedly to stay away from dangerous prey, to hunt only gentle creatures like rabbits or deer. Wild boars, she told him, were too dangerous. Bears were too fierce. He should be careful. Adonis, young and confident as young men tend to be, listened politely and then ignored her advice. He was skilled with a spear. He'd hunted countless animals. What was one more boar? One day, while Aphrodite was away, Adonis encountered a massive wild boar. It was a beast of exceptional size and ferocity, and instead of retreating, Adonis raised his spear. He struck the boar, wounding it, but not fatally. Enraged and in pain, the boar turned on him. With a speed that belied its size, it charged, and its tusks found Adonis's groin, tearing into flesh. Adonis fell, bleeding, crying out for Aphrodite. The goddess heard his cries from far away and came rushing, her chariot pulled by doves flying faster than they'd ever flown. But she was too late. By the time she reached him, Adonis was dying. She held him in her arms, her tears falling onto his wounds, mixing with his blood. In some versions of the story, the boar was sent by Ares, jealous of the time Aphrodite spent with Adonis. In others, it was Artemis, seeking revenge for past slights. In still others, it was simply an animal acting on instinct, and the tragedy needed no divine intervention to occur. As Adonis's blood soaked into the earth, Aphrodite wept. She couldn't save him. For all her power, for all her divinity, she couldn't bring him back. But she could memorialize him. She caused flowers to spring from his blood, delicate red anemones that bloomed briefly each spring and then faded. She also decreed that a festival would be held each year in his honor, the Adonia, where women would mourn his death. There's another detail to the story, often mentioned in passing. As Aphrodite rushed to Adonis's side, she ran through a thicket of white roses. The thorns tore at her feet, and her divine blood stained the white petals red. Since that day, roses have been red, forever marked by the goddess's grief. The story of Adonis resonated deeply with the ancient Greeks. It spoke to the inevitability of death, the tragedy of losing someone you love, the pain of being powerless. Even Aphrodite, who could inspire love in gods and mortals alike, who could start wars and topple kingdoms, couldn't prevent the death of the one person she truly loved. The Adonia festival became a major event, particularly among women. They would plant quick-growing gardens called Gardens of Adonis, which would bloom rapidly and then wither, symbolizing Adonis's short life. They would mourn loudly, wailing and beating their breasts, giving voice to grief that the goddess herself had felt. In some versions of the myth, Zeus took pity on Aphrodite and allowed Adonis to return from the underworld for part of each year, mirroring the agreement about the division of his time. This made Adonis a dying and rising god, a figure associated with vegetation and the cycle of the seasons. His death marked the coming of winter, his return the arrival of spring. It's a bittersweet resolution. Aphrodite got him back, but not fully, not permanently. She would lose him again and again every year, an eternal cycle of reunion and loss. For a goddess who was used to getting what she wanted, it must have been unbearable. And perhaps that's the point. Love, even for gods, involves loss. Desire brings both ecstasy and pain. Aphrodite, who ruled over all forms of love, was not exempt from love's cruelties. She was subject to them, just like anyone else. The goddess who could wound others with desire was herself wounded, and unlike her injury at Troy, this wound never fully healed. Adonis was not the only mortal Aphrodite loved, though he was perhaps the one who affected her most deeply. There was also Anchises, a shepherd prince of Troy, whose encounter with the goddess produced one of the great heroes of ancient mythology. Aphrodite came to Anchises disguised as a mortal woman, though her beauty was such that even disguised, she seemed almost divine. She seduced him, and afterward, when the passion had cooled, she revealed her true nature. Anchises was terrified. Mortals who slept with gods often met unfortunate ends, either through divine jealousy or simply because the human body wasn't meant to contain such experiences. But Aphrodite assured him he would be fine. She was pregnant with his child, she told him, and that child would be a great hero. His name would be Aeneas. She warned Anchises never to boast about their affair, never to tell anyone that he'd lain with a goddess, As long as he kept silent, all would be well. Anchises kept the secret for years, but wine loosens tongues, and one night drunk at a feast he let slip the truth. Zeus, hearing the boast, was not amused. He hurled a thunderbolt at Anchises. Some versions say it killed him, others say it merely crippled him, leaving him lame for the rest of his life. Either way, the warning was clear. Do not boast about the favors of the gods. Aeneas, the son born of that union, became one of the great heroes of Troy. When the city fell, Aphrodite guided him to safety, ensuring he escaped with his father and his son. Aeneas would eventually sail to Italy, where his descendants would found Rome. Thus, Aphrodite became, in a sense, the ancestress of the Roman people, and when the Romans adopted Greek mythology, they venerated her as Venus Genetrix, the mother of their nation. Then there was Pygmalion, though his story was different. Pygmalion was a sculptor, a master of his craft, who had grown disillusioned with women. The Propoetides, a group of women who had denied Aphrodite as their goddess, had been cursed by the goddess to become the first prostitutes. Seeing their shameless behavior, Pygmalion decided he wanted nothing to do with real women. Instead, he poured his energy into his art. He sculpted a statue of a woman, carving ivory into a form of such perfect beauty that even he was amazed. She was ideal in every way, flawless, the embodiment of everything he thought a woman should be. And then, slowly, he realized he'd fallen in love with his own creation, love. He knew it was madness. She was ivory, cold and lifeless, but he couldn't help himself. He dressed the statue in fine clothes, gave it jewelry, spoke to it as though it could hear him. He brought offerings to Aphrodite's temple, praying that he might find a wife like his statue. Aphrodite, touched by his devotion and perhaps amused by the irony of a man who rejected women falling in love with an image of one, decided to grant his wish. She brought the statue to life. When Pygmalion returned home and kissed the ivory lips, they warmed beneath his touch. The statue breathed, moved, and became a living woman. In later retellings, she was given the name Galatea, though ancient sources don't name her. She became Pygmalion's wife, and they lived happily, or so the story goes. Some modern interpretations question this happiness, asking what life would be like for a woman who literally had no existence outside of being someone else's ideal. But in the ancient telling, it was a love story, pure and simple. Aphrodite had rewarded genuine devotion with the miracle of life itself. These stories, and others like them, show different facets of Aphrodite's nature. With Adonis, she was vulnerable, capable of being hurt. With Anchises, she was dangerous, her favor coming with warnings and consequences. With Pygmalion, she was benevolent, rewarding those who honored her properly. But in all these stories, one thing remained constant. Aphrodite was never passive. She didn't simply inspire love from a distance. She involved herself directly in the lives of mortals, for better or worse. She meddled, manipulated, blessed, and cursed. Love in her hands was an active force, not a gentle emotion, but a power that changed the world. If you wanted to honor Aphrodite, or even just recognize her presence, you'd need to know her symbols. And she had many. The Greeks, and later the Romans, filled her temples with objects that represented different aspects of her nature. Each symbol told a story, each carried meaning. The dove was perhaps her most recognizable sacred animal. White doves, gentle and affectionate, were said to draw her chariot through the sky. They represented peace, love, and the tender side of her nature. Doves were released at her festivals, and finding a white dove was considered a blessing from the goddess. There's even a myth that explains why doves became sacred to her. A nymph named Peristera once helped Aphrodite win a flower-picking contest against Eros. In revenge, Eros transformed Peristera into a dove, but Aphrodite took the bird under her protection, making it sacred to her forever. The swan and the goose were also her creatures. She was often depicted riding a swan or goose side saddle, gliding across water. These birds represented grace and beauty, the elegance of movement that Aphrodite embodied. Sparrows, too, were sacred to her, mentioned in Sappho's poetry as pulling the goddess's chariot, their quick, darting movements perhaps symbolizing the sudden strike of desire. Among flowers, the rose reigned supreme. Red roses especially belonged to Aphrodite, their color a reminder of the blood she shed rushing to Adonis. Roses represented passionate love, beauty, the fleeting nature of pleasure. Greeks wore rose wreaths at her festivals and offered roses at her altars. The rose's thorns, hidden beneath its beauty, perhaps symbolized love's capacity to wound. The myrtle was another sacred plant. Myrtle wreaths were worn at weddings, and myrtle groves surrounded many of her temples. The tree's connection to Aphrodite came from the myth of Adonis. His mother, Myrrha, had been transformed into a myrrh tree, and from that tree Adonis was born. Thus myrrh and myrtle became associated with the goddess, representing transformation and the bittersweet nature of love. Anemones, those brief spring flowers, reminded worshippers of Adonis. They bloomed early and faded quickly, just as his life had been cut short. Women would plant anemones during the Adonia festival, watching them grow and die in a matter of days, a living representation of mortality and loss. The apple was a potent symbol, forever linked to the Judgement of Paris. Golden apples represented desire, temptation, the dangerous allure of beauty. Offering an apple to someone was a declaration of love. Accepting it was acceptance of that love. The apple's association with Aphrodite made it both a gift and a warning. Then there was the pomegranate, a fruit with complex symbolism. Its red seeds represented fertility and the loss of virginity. Pomegranates were offered at weddings and eaten by new brides. The fruit's connection to Persephone's myth, where eating pomegranate seeds bound her to the underworld, added layers of meaning about the binding nature of sexual union. Among objects, the mirror was quintessentially hers. Vanity, self-awareness, the recognition of one's own beauty, all of these were Aphrodite's domain. The mirror became so associated with her that the symbol for female, that circle with a cross beneath, was originally a stylized representation of Aphrodite's hand mirror. Every time you see that symbol, you're looking at a remnant of the goddess's iconography. Her magical girdle, the cestus, deserved special mention. This was a belt or sash woven with the powers of love and desire. When Aphrodite wore it, she became absolutely irresistible. Even Hera borrowed it once, when she needed to seduce Zeus to distract him from the Trojan War. The girdle represented the purest form of Aphrodite's power, desire itself made tangible. Seashells, particularly the scallop shell, reminded worshippers of her birth from the sea. She was often depicted standing on or emerging from a large shell. Botticelli's famous Renaissance painting, The Birth of Venus, captured this image perfectly, showing the goddess rising from the waves on a shell, blown to shore by winds. Dolphins and fish were sacred to her as a sea goddess. Dolphins represented playfulness and joy, the lighter aspects of love. They were intelligent, social creatures, traits that Aphrodite embodied in her gentler moments. Her temples were built primarily on coastlines or near the sea. Cyprus remained her most sacred island, particularly the city of Paphos, where her temple was one of the wonders of the ancient world. Cythera, the first island she touched after her birth, also had major cult centers. Corinth's temple to Aphrodite was famous, though later sources made controversial claims about sacred prostitution there that modern scholars largely dispute. The Aphrodisia was her major festival, celebrated annually in midsummer. Women would gather at her temples, making offerings of flowers, incense, and doves. Unlike some gods who demanded blood sacrifice, Aphrodite preferred gentler offerings: milk, honey, flowers. These were the gifts she favored. The festival was a time of joy, of celebrating love in all its forms, of honoring the force that brought people together. During the Aphrodisia in Athens, the temple would be purified with dove's blood. The altars would be anointed, and processions would wind through the streets carrying statues of the goddess. Women would pray for successful marriages, for fertility, for the blessing of beauty. Men would pray for success in courtship, for the favor of the women they desired. The fourth day of every month was sacred to her, marked by smaller observances and offerings. This regular devotion ensured that Aphrodite remained present in daily life, not just during major festivals, but throughout the year. All these symbols, these animals and plants and objects, created a rich language through which the Greeks communicated with and about Aphrodite. Seeing a dove meant thinking of love. Smelling roses meant remembering passion. Finding a perfect seashell on the beach was a reminder that beauty could emerge from chaos, that something glorious could be born from violence. And perhaps that's why Aphrodite's symbols endure even now, millennia after her temples fell silent. We still give roses to lovers. We still use doves at weddings. We still associate seashells with the ocean's mysteries. The goddess may no longer receive sacrifices, but her symbols persist, embedded so deeply in our culture that we use them without thinking about their origins. For all her associations with beauty and desire, Aphrodite could be ruthless. Cross her, insult her, refuse to honor her properly, and you would learn that love could be a weapon as sharp as any sword. The goddess had a vindictive streak, and several myths illustrated what happened to those who earned her displeasure. Take the case of Hippolytus, son of Theseus. Hippolytus was devoted to Artemis, goddess of the hunt and virginity. He spent his days in the forest, hunting, training, living a life of chastity and athletic dedication. This was noble enough. Artemis appreciated his devotion, but Hippolytus made a fatal error. He didn't just worship Artemis, he actively scorned Aphrodite. He declared that love and marriage were beneath him, that physical desire was degrading, that Aphrodite's domain was worthless. Aphrodite, hearing these insults, decided to teach the young man a lesson about the power of desire. She caused his stepmother, Phaedra, to fall desperately in love with him. Phaedra, horrified by her own feelings, tried to resist. She knew the passion was wrong, knew it could only end in disaster, but Aphrodite's curse was too strong. Eventually, Phaedra confessed her love to Hippolytus. He reacted with disgust, rejecting her violently, calling her shameless and depraved. Phaedra, devastated and fearing exposure, decided on a terrible course. She killed herself. But first, she wrote a letter falsely accusing Hippolytus of attempting to rape her. When Theseus found his wife dead and read the letter, he was consumed with rage. He called upon his father Poseidon, who had granted him 3 wishes, and used one to curse his own son. Poseidon sent a bull from the sea that frightened Hippolytus's horses as he drove his chariot along the coast. The horses panicked, the chariot overturned, and Hippolytus was dragged to his death, tangled in the reins. Artemis, too late, revealed the truth to Theseus. Hippolytus had been innocent, and Phaedra's love had been Aphrodite's curse. Theseus was left with the knowledge that he'd killed his own son, manipulated by a goddess he'd failed to sufficiently honor. The entire tragedy, from beginning to end, was Aphrodite's revenge for being scorned. Then there was the story of the Lemnian women. The women of Lemnos had neglected to honor Aphrodite properly. Some versions say they simply forgot to make offerings. Others claim they were overly devoted to Athena and ignored the goddess of love. Either way, Aphrodite took offense. Her punishment was creative and cruel. She cursed the women with a foul odor. They stank, constantly and overwhelmingly, to the point where their husbands couldn't bear to be near them. The men of Lemnos began taking Thracian concubines, abandoning their wives entirely. The women, driven to desperation by this rejection, came together and made a dark decision. One night they slaughtered every man on the island, husbands, fathers, sons, all dead. Lemnos became an island of women only, ruled by Queen Hypsipyle. Later, when the Argonauts stopped at Lemnos during their quest for the Golden Fleece, the women welcomed them, desperate for companionship and the possibility of children. Jason stayed with Hypsipyle, and from that union came children. The island eventually repopulated, but the original crime, the murder of every man, that began with Aphrodite's curse. The goddess also had conflicts with her fellow Olympians. Her relationship with Artemis was particularly fraught. Artemis represented chastity, virginity, independence. She and her followers rejected marriage and physical love entirely. This was fundamentally opposed to everything Aphrodite stood for. The two goddesses tolerated each other at best and actively worked against each other at worst. Athena and Aphrodite had their own tension. Athena was wisdom and strategic warfare, born from Zeus's head, a virgin goddess with no interest in romance. She found Aphrodite frivolous, her domains unserious. Aphrodite, in turn, likely viewed Athena as cold and joyless. The Judgement of Paris cemented their enmity. From that point on, they were on opposite sides of every conflict, Aphrodite supporting Troy, while Athena championed the Greeks. Even Apollo felt Aphrodite's wrath at times. In some versions of the Adonis myth, it was Apollo who killed the young hunter, transforming into a boar to gore him. The reason varies depending on the telling. Some say Apollo was jealous, others claim Aphrodite had blinded one of Apollo's sons, but the result was the same. Divine conflicts played out through mortal suffering. These stories paint a picture of Aphrodite as more than just a goddess of love. She was also a goddess of revenge, of wounded pride, of ensuring that her domain was respected. Love, in her hands, wasn't always gentle or kind. It could be used to punish, to destroy, to teach lessons that left bodies in their wake. The Greeks understood this duality. They knew that desire could ruin lives as easily as it could create them. They knew that passion could lead to madness, that beauty could mask danger. Aphrodite embodied all of it, the ecstasy and the agony, the joy and the destruction. She wasn't safe, she was powerful, and power, divine or otherwise, must be respected. Standing back and looking at Aphrodite's mythology as a whole, a pattern emerges. She was perhaps the most human of the gods, not in the sense of being mortal or weak, but in the sense of embodying human experiences more directly than most of her divine family. Zeus represented power and authority. Hera embodied marriage and loyalty, albeit twisted by jealousy. Athena was wisdom and civilization. Ares was violence and chaos. Apollo was order and light. These were grand concepts, forces that shaped the world but remained somewhat abstract. Aphrodite was desire. She was the feeling you get when you see someone beautiful. She was the irrational decision to chase after what you want, regardless of consequences. She was the pain of losing someone you love. She was the joy of requited affection. She was vanity and pride and tenderness and cruelty, all wrapped together. The Greeks didn't see love as purely positive. They understood its darker implications. Eros, Aphrodite's companion or son, depending on the version, was often depicted as a mischievous child shooting arrows indiscriminately, causing both mortals and gods to fall in love with inappropriate partners. This wasn't romantic, it was dangerous. Love, in Greek thought, was a form of madness, a temporary insanity that could make you do things your rational mind would never approve. Aphrodite presided over this madness. She could be kind as with Pygmalion. She could be passionate as with Ares and Adonis. She could be vengeful as with Hippolytus and countless others. She contained multitudes, and the Greeks worshipped her, not despite her complexity, but because of it. When Rome absorbed Greek mythology, they adapted Aphrodite into Venus. The basics remained the same: goddess of love and beauty, born from the sea, mother of Aeneas. But Venus took on additional characteristics. She became Venus Genetrix, the mother of the Roman people through Aeneas's line. Julius Caesar claimed descent from her, and subsequent emperors followed suit. Venus became not just a goddess of love, but a goddess of Roman destiny, her protection ensuring Rome's greatness. The Romans also emphasized her connection to fertility and agriculture, aspects present but less prominent in the Greek tradition. Venus was invoked at planting and harvest, her favor sought for abundant crops and livestock. She became woven into the civic religion in ways that Aphrodite never quite achieved in Greece. But underneath the Roman overlay, the essence of Aphrodite remained. She was still the goddess who could make heroes forget their duties, who could start wars with a word, who could bless or curse depending on her mood. She was still dangerous, still beautiful, still utterly irresistible. Her mythology raises questions that the Greeks never fully answered. What is the nature of love? Is it divine gift or divine curse? Can desire be controlled, or does it control us? What happens when beauty and morality conflict? When passion and duty pull in opposite directions? The Greeks didn't provide neat answers because there aren't any. Love is complicated. Desire is messy. Beauty can be a blessing or a burden. Aphrodite, in all her contradictions, represented these truths. She was the goddess who reminded mortals that they were, at their core, driven by forces they couldn't fully control or understand. And perhaps that's why her myths endure. We still tell stories about the destructiveness of desire, about love triangles and forbidden romances, and beauty that launches ships. We still understand the pain of losing someone we love, the irrationality of attraction, the way desire can make us do things we'd normally consider beneath us. Aphrodite's stories are our stories, dressed in divine robes and set against backdrops of burning cities and enchanted gardens. Strip away the gods and monsters, and what remains are fundamentally human experiences. Wanting someone you can't have, loving someone who doesn't love you back, making terrible choices in the name of passion, finding joy in another person's presence, grieving when that person is gone. The goddess of love was never meant to make love simple or easy. She made it powerful, overwhelming, sometimes wonderful and sometimes terrible, but always worth paying attention to. Because love, in the end, is what makes us human. And Aphrodite, rising from the sea foam crowned in roses accompanied by doves, reminded the Greeks, the Romans, and now us, that this power, this madness, this blessing and curse is central to what we are. So there you have it, the story of Aphrodite, goddess of love, beauty, and conflict. Born from an act of violence, she brought both joy and ruin to the world. She married a husband she didn't choose, loved a god of war, and mourned a mortal hunter. She started the Trojan War over a beauty contest, wept over the dying Adonis, and cursed those who failed to honor her properly. She was never simple, never one-dimensional. She couldn't be. Love isn't simple. Desire isn't straightforward. Beauty carries its own complications. And Aphrodite, in embodying all of these forces, became one of the most complex and compelling figures in all of mythology. Her temples may be ruins now, her festivals no longer celebrated, her statues weathered by time, but her influence endures. Every time we give flowers to someone we love, every time we make a choice driven by desire rather than reason, every time we experience the bittersweet ache of longing or the fierce joy of requited affection, we're touching something that the Greeks would have recognized as Aphrodite's domain. The goddess is gone, perhaps. The belief is mostly gone too. But the forces she represented, those are eternal. As long as humans feel desire, experience beauty, fall in love, and deal with the consequences of those feelings, Aphrodite's story will remain relevant. And with that, we'll close our exploration of the foam-born goddess. I hope this story brought you some peace, or at least some interesting thoughts to drift off with. If you enjoyed this, consider subscribing for more tales from the ancient world. And if you have suggestions for future myths to explore, leave them in the comments below. Rest well wherever you are in the world. And remember that even gods who ruled over love found it complicated. So if you're struggling with matters of the heart, you're in good company. Until next time.